Okay. Hello, if you guys are joining and you can see my screen, I'd love to hear where you guys are joining from, and just to double check that you can all see my screen clearly. Fantastic. Got Ohio, Michigan, Denver, Indianapolis, Greece, Colorado, Texas, UK. Wow, this is great. Ohio again, Knoxville, Tennessee, Washington State, Monterey, Leicester, UK. It's close to where I'm from. I'm from Nottingham in the UK. See your screen fine. Great. Amsterdam, Alabama, fantastic. I'm just going to give it 1 more minute, everyone, just to make sure everyone joins, and then I'll just kick off with some housekeeping very quickly. Miami, Toronto, Alberta, Anaheim. Oh, Robin Hood. Yes, Robin Hood indeed. Devon in the UK. Am I a sheriff? Not yet.
Someday.
Someday.
Get you there.
Yeah. One more from Washington.
I see some familiar names in the chat. Hello, friends.
More from Merryman. I'll take that, you know. Hello from Tokyo. Wow. Okay, right. I will kick off, guys. So hello, everyone. My name is Joe from Pro Writing Aid, and thanks so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I would just like to go through a few housekeeping items. So welcome to Fantasy Writers Week 2024. So how to access your replays. So replays will be added to the hub page once they are done being processed by Zoom. This does take a little bit of time and it can vary, so please don't worry. It will be added as soon as possible. And replays will be available on the Pro Writing Aid community page for all members to view by May 3rd. So a few details on our premium day. So Monday to Thursday sessions are free for everyone to attend. Friday sessions are limited to Premium and Premium Pro users. Free users can upgrade their accounts by Friday morning to get access, and Premium Pro users will receive an email Friday morning with instructions for attending the live sessions and viewing the replays. So your offer. So we are currently offering 25% off on yearly Premium and Premium Pro licenses. Purchasing a Premium or Premium Pro license will unlock tools such as our rephrase and our AI Sparks and critique report features. You can get reports on unlimited word counts, author suggestions, full integrations for Scrivener, Word, and much, much more. And this offer ends on May 10th. And as always, you can find out more information on the hub. And if you'd like to keep talking fantasy, you can join our online writing community using your Pro Writing Aid login. Here you can keep talking with other fantasy fans and keep up to date with more of our writing events. And I will be posting these links in the chat as we go, so don't worry if you miss it this time around, folks. So just a few reminders for this session. Please use the Q&A box if you have questions for our speaker or for myself. If you'd like to chat with other viewers, please use the chat box. Links to your offers and from our speakers will be available on the Fantasy Writers Week hub and in our participants guide as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. I will now introduce our speaker. So today we are joined by Lewis Jorstad. Lewis is a book coach and editor who helps passionate fiction writers master their craft and find their readers at the novel smithy. When he isn't helping students or writing books of his own, you can find him babying his houseplants and baking far too many homemade bagels. That sounds lovely. So I will now hand over to Lewis for what I'm sure will be a fantastic session. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the introduction, Joe. That was great. Hello, everybody. I see some familiar names in the chat. I see people I've never met before. It's great to see all of you here. I'm going to take a second to just get set up, get everything sort of in position. As Joe mentioned, if you have questions throughout the workshop, I would recommend putting them in the Q&A box. I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat because there's just too much going on, and I want to be able to teach you all instead of sort of distractedly looking to the side of my screen. But let me take a second to get set up. All right. I will actually have in the chat thumbs up if you can see everything fine, if everything looks good, and then we'll dive into things. Awesome. Seeing lots of thumbs up. Sweet. Okay. Let me. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Uh, so, again, thanks to Joe for the introduction. I am here today for Fantasy Writers Week to chat with you all about how to write Crossroads in your novel. We're going to explain sort of what that means and what that looks like in just a moment, but sort of the short and sweet version, the preview of what's to come, is that in today's workshop, we're going to be talking about how to write the four big turning points of your story, sort of the pivotal scenes, the big set pieces of your novel that leave a really major impact on your readers, that are what your readers are going to remember when they put down your story, that are going to shape, their experience of your novel and their feelings about your novel. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about how can you start to plan those key pieces? How can you start to plan those pivotal moments, but with a bit of a twist? How can you write them in such a way that they carry the kind of impact you need to be memorable for your readers and to have a reason to exist in your story? Because that's not always a given. An exciting moment in your plot might not necessarily always be something that actually connects with your readers on that deeper, more memorable level. And so we're going to talk about the difference and how you can actually achieve that in your stories. Now, to sort of give you the big idea up front, the reason that we're talking about this is that your plot needs to be more than just a string of cause and effect. No matter how interesting those effects may be or how interesting all of the different scenes in your novel may be. And the reason I say that is that over the years working as an editor, working, as a writer myself, working as a book coach, I'll introduce myself more in just a moment. But I have seen so many stories that work on paper. The plot is interesting on paper. There are no major plot holes on paper. There are no red flags of like, oh, this plot has serious problems. But despite that, I found it really hard to care about those plots. And the feedback those writers were often getting was also from beta readers, from agents, from reviews, from various places, was also that, yeah, the plot is interesting and it makes sense, but I just don't care. I'm not invested in the story. I don't really feel the need to keep flipping pages and to keep moving deeper into the novel. And so, yes, the plot worked on the surface, but there was a key ingredient that was missing that needed to be sort of interjected into all of this so that readers could develop that more emotional, deeper connection to the story. And the way I like to illustrate this is with this idea that if a tree falls in the forest, but it doesn't hit anyone, who really cares? Yes, there are going to be some arborists in the chat who are like, I care about the tree and I am here for you and I agree with you. But in the context of your novel, I think this point is something to keep in mind. Yes, you can be having car chases and explosions and arguments and, all of this drama, all of this action, all of this plot, but why do your readers care? And fundamentally, what makes our readers care about a story is a story that has stakes. Things are at risk. Things could go wrong. A story that has impact and consequences. There is meaning in terms of what these events mean for other characters in your novel, for the world of your novel, for the protagonist of your novel. And most importantly, sort of at the top of that list, your plot needs a catalyst. It needs some force in the story that is kicking the plot into action, that is moving the plot forward, and where it doesn't just feel like, oh, I'm reading this plot, but I can see the author just sort of moving the pieces on the board, saying, like, well, this is how I wanted to write the story, so this is what's going to happen. You need something within your story itself to act as that driving force, that catalyst for the story that can give it that sense of stakes and impact that feels genuine and really realistic and believable for your readers. So, in this workshop, there are going to be three big things we're going to talk about. The first of these is we're going to start looking at how you can build a plot that your readers can really care about with one simple mindset shift, thinking about your story from a slightly different angle to make sure readers can get invested in the novel. We're also going to be planning the four big decisions that define your protagonist's story. We're going to be looking at how you can select those decisions, how you can make sure those decisions have the amount of weight that they need. And at the very end, I am going to toss a little bit of homework your way. I'm going to be the mean teacher that assigns homework, but we're going to do a quick brainstorming exercise, or I'm going to introduce a quick brainstorming exercise to help you jumpstart this process, to help you start to figure out how you can make some of these changes in your own story or troubleshoot sections of your story that you maybe realize aren't pulling their weight the way that you want them to. With that said, enough introduction. Real quick, for those of you who don't know me, I know Joe introduced me briefly, and I know some of you here are familiar with me. You've met me from around the web, but I am Louis Jorstad. I'm the founder of The Novel Smithy, where I help passionate fiction writers master their craft and find their readers. And I have been sort of in this space for a while now, which is kind of interesting to say. We are approaching year 7 of being an editor. I've been a developmental editor for just about 7 years now. I'm the author of 7 writing craft guides on everything from series structure to character development to outlining to editing. And I am a really big story nerd. I am deeply passionate about how we can use different tricks and frameworks and ways of approaching our novels in order to tell the best story possible, and a story that really resonates with our readers while still feeling very true to us, still feeling like our story and our voice, but telling it to the best of our ability so that our readers want to come along for the ride. And since this is Fantasy Writers Week, I feel like it's appropriate to say that I'm also a dark fantasy writer in my own sort of personal writing life. I struggle not to dabble with other genres. I'm actually working on a cyberpunk novel at the moment, but probably my biggest love in terms of my own writing is definitely dark fantasy. More importantly, though, in terms of tonight's or today's workshop, depending on where you are in the world, part of why I care about this topic so much is how what we're going to be talking about, these crossroads that I'm going to teach you, help simplify plot, sort of in a broad sense. Because I find a lot of us, we're trying to juggle a story structure. We're trying to juggle maybe multiple character arcs. We have to think about the relationships of our characters and how are we foreshadowing things, and where are we adding world building, and what's the pacing of our story like. And that's a lot to kind of hold in our brain all at once. And it can feel very overwhelming and very stressful. And part of why I love these crossroads that I'm going to teach you about is that they take your plots and they take your character development and they squish them together into one really cohesive story. And in doing so, they simplify things. You're not juggling a plot and a character arc and foreshadowing and pacing. You're just juggling these 4 big turning points, and they pull a lot of that weight for you and do a lot of that work for you so that you can focus on telling your story and figuring out where you want your novel to go rather than feeling overwhelmed and locked up trying to figure out, well, how can I balance all of these different things that are expected of me as a writer? So, the big takeaway here, where I want to start for this workshop, is this idea, and that is that your protagonist's decisions are what drives your plot. Because they are your central character, because they are the main character of your novel, their choices are going to define every beat of your story, and that is especially true in the key moments of your story. Those big turning points I mentioned, those big set pieces, the exciting scenes or, action moments where everything changes and everything is intense and dramatic. The reason that those scenes carry that weight is because your protagonist's choices and decisions have led us to that moment. And this is something that I believe in theory, but also really in practice. And so there's a couple reasons why I think it's really valuable to think about your plot in terms of your protagonist's decisions before you start to think about your plot in terms of just cause and effect. This scene and then this scene and then this scene. Zooming back and building your story around a couple really key choices that your protagonist makes allows you to do four major things. It gives your protagonist agency and control in the story. So they aren't just being drug around by their ear. They're not just being sort of forced through your plot against their will. Yes, they can definitely be put in situations they don't want to be in. They can definitely be sort of backed into a corner. But how they respond to those events is within their control. They're making those choices. And that makes them a more engaging character, but it also makes them a bigger player in your story. It lets them earn that role as your central character. This also, as I mentioned a moment ago, helps link your plot and your character development. So again, rather than thinking like, I have to juggle this big complicated story structure and I have to juggle all these complicated character arcs, you can say, I need to focus on four decisions. I need to focus on a few key choices my protagonist is going to make to do 80% of that work. And then the other 20%, you can go in and sort of tinker and adjust, but it does so much of the heavy lifting for you. This also helps you create stakes. Again, a key part of creating a plot that your readers care about is to have stakes and to have the very real risk of failure. Because if your protagonist is making choices in your story, it's always possible that they're going to make the wrong choice at different parts of your novel. And in fact, I'm going to encourage you to have your protagonist make the wrong decision at different points of your story. That creates stakes, it creates risk, it creates reward, and it creates that effect of a page turner where your readers want to see, are they going to get this right? Are they going to be able to figure this out? And finally, these key decisions are going to help you show how your protagonist is changing as a person. So I've mentioned character arcs a few times, and for any of you who are maybe familiar with character arcs, you know that one of the hardest parts of writing a character arc is making it feel believable, because you're trying to make your character change over time. You're taking them from point A to point B, and you're trying to make that transformation feel really natural. But that can be really hard to do on a scene by scene level. And so what these decisions we're going to talk about in this workshop will let you do is start to build in some of that change in a more slow and steady way, so that by the time you get to the end of your story, readers are fully bought in to this, evolution of your character, to the growth that they've gone through, because they've seen it happen a little bit at a time in a way that makes a lot of logical and emotional sense for them as readers. Most importantly, sort of above all else, this gives your readers a reason to care about your story. This is how we create that impact that I talked about. Because, like it or not, in every genre, whether you're in a character-focused genre, whether you're writing, a really sweet, like cozy romance, or you're writing a super intense, spy thriller or horror, or you're writing, fantasy or fantasy with any flavor of any other genre, we as readers care about stories that have a human element. We can identify with your characters, we can relate to your characters, we can step into their shoes for a little while and understand how they're feeling and how they're experiencing your story, and use that to create the emotions in us as readers that make that story feel like it has an impact, like it has a meaning for us. And it also gives an answer to the question of why is this story happening the way that it is? Rather than feeling like it's a little bit contrived, like you as the author, again, are sort of floating above it, pulling all the puppet strings in your novel, having your protagonist driving the ship makes it really easy for readers to suspend their disbelief and say, this is why this is happening, because this character made these decisions that have led to these consequences and to these outcomes. And they can start to really get fully engaged with the story because they're not sitting there thinking like, well, clearly the author is the one who made this choice. So before we get into deeper into maybe the uh, actual pieces of this system of sort of what you need to do at each of these decisions, how they're going to fit into your novel, I actually want to pull back and give you an example so that you can see when I'm talking about decisions, what does this look like? So for any of you who are familiar with me, who have seen any workshop I've taught, you'll know that I almost always use Mulan as an example. It's one of my favorite movies, but it's also a really great example of a lot of these concepts. And so if you are at all familiar with this movie, there are four major decisions that Mulan makes throughout that story. The first of these is to sneak into the army rather than see her father get killed. So at the start of her story, she is uh, feeling sort of isolated, sort of beat down. She is not valued by the people around her very much. And that's very hurtful and very frustrating. And, you know, the conflict arrives in her life when a messenger from the emperor arrives and delivers a draft notice to her family. Your father's been called to war, the Huns are invading China, and she has to sort of wrestle with the reality that her father is almost definitely going to die. He's an old man, he's already been wounded in past battles, he's not going to come home if he leaves. And so she ends up making the decision to sneak into the army in his place rather than let that happen to him, because this is her way of being useful. It's her way of stepping up and feeling like she has a role to play in this family. That eventually leads her into a variety of other decisions. During boot camp, she's really struggling. She has no friends. No one really likes her. She's having a really hard time keeping up. She makes the decision to prove herself as a soldier rather than go home in disgrace. Later in the story, she makes the decision to apologize for who she is when it's discovered that she's not really a soldier. She's not her father's son. She's her father's daughter. And rather than stand up for herself, she makes a kind of negative decision and she apologizes for who she is and she backs down rather than, fight for the fact that she's just as good as anyone else there. And finally, towards the end of her story, she makes the decision to embrace her talents and to embrace herself, as a leader, as someone that she doesn't need to be ashamed of, rather than trying to pretend to be someone that she's not. So I show you this to help you start to see what these decisions are and maybe what I'm talking about when I talk about them, but also because I want you to start thinking, what are some of the decisions that your own protagonist is making in your story? What are some of these really big, weighty choices that they're making in your novel when they're presented with these options? Do I do something or do I do nothing? Do I, face this challenge or this obstacle or this person that I'm really intimidated by, or do I back down? How are those decisions playing out in your own novel? Now, the result of this, of placing these decisions before your plot, is that you anchor your story's most powerful moments around the choices of your protagonist. And in doing so, again, you show how they're changing over time in real concrete ways. So if you think about that example we just looked at, the first major decision Mulan makes in her story, and certainly she makes smaller decisions here and there, but the first big pivotal decision she makes is to disguise herself as someone that she's not, because she doesn't have the ability to enact change as herself, both because of her society, but also because of her beliefs about herself. By the end of the story, though, she makes the decision to fully stand up as this is who I am and face the challenges of her story not as someone else, but as herself. And we remember the actions these characters take more than what they think about or say they want to do or say they feel. When those are reflected through the actions that they take, it becomes much more real and much more concrete and impactful. And so that's what this helps you start to do. But at the same time, it also helps you start to create shifts in your plot that feel earned. So you'll notice in all of those examples that there were two paths. You can decide to do X rather than Y, or you can decide to do Y rather than X. At each of those points, there was a fork in the road where the character could go in multiple different directions. And this makes readers start to wonder of what would have happened if that character made a different choice? What would the consequences have been? What would the impact have been? And again, that helps create that sense that these events aren't just being made up for the plot to happen, to make sure that the plot is moving where the author wants. Instead, it is a clear path that the character has chosen, and that makes it feel real and weighty and earned for your readers. So let's get into how you can actually start applying this. That was all the theory, sort of the big idea behind this method. But the method to the madness, the method to actually achieving this, is what I like to call the 4 Crossroads method. And this method basically states, again, it was no accident that there were 4 decisions in that example, because this method states that there are 4 turning points in your plot, and that these scenes need to mark key decisions on the part of your hero that tell readers who they are at that point in the story while pushing your plot forward. So everything that we've talked about so far sort of summed up in an actual process for achieving this. And this method is sort of interesting in that it kind of straddles the line between, story structure or plot structure and character development. It kind of exists in both spaces. And this is very much on purpose because unlike a lot of traditional story structures that you might be familiar with, the 3-act structure, the 4-act structure, the hero's journey, all of those structures are really plot first. They focus on what is happening in your plot, when is it happening in your plot, and that's really valuable. But the benefit of the 4 Crossroads is that this method puts your protagonist first. Your plot is not happening to them. Instead, their decisions are defining your plot. Now, again, don't get me wrong, they are going to struggle. They are going to be forced into situations that they don't want to be in. In fact, you're almost certainly going to have to force them into situations they don't want to be in to get them to make these difficult decisions. But at all of the major events of your story, it's how they choose to respond that is really shaping your plot, that is really driving your plot forward rather than the other way around. And so again, there are 4 crossroads, and each of these crossroads serves a purpose in your story. You'll notice on this slide, there's plot development and there's character development, because again, each of these crossroads connects the two, and each of them has a role to play in your novel. So we're gonna run through all 4 sort of high level real quick, and then I'm gonna show you how they connect together. So this first crossroad, the first sort of major pivotal decision in your story, I like to think of as the decision to engage. This is when your protagonist makes the choice to get involved in your plot, in the conflict of your story, in whatever is happening in your novel. And so on the plot side of things, up until now, your core conflict has kind of upended their normal life. It has charged onto the scene. Everyone, things are different, things are changing, there are problems. Suddenly the peace has been disturbed. And your protagonist is given a choice. They can either engage with that plot, or they can do nothing and they can just back away and you have no story. So at this first crossroad, what you're really pushing your protagonist to do is to make a decision that ultimately embroils them in the plot of your story. And in doing so, you kind of end Act One of your novel. Act One is all about setting things up, sort of getting all of the pieces in place for the rest of your story. And so for you all as fantasy writers, this is the really um, classic like leaving home scene. Your character does not have to leave home as the first crossroad. Um, their world can change even if they're in the same place the whole time because people, the situation has changed or their relationships have changed. But oftentimes in a lot of fantasy, this is the moment where they leave their known world. They make the decision to venture out on this quest or this journey to venture into the unknown, thus kind of beginning the plot of your story. On the character development side, this is also a chance for your protagonist, again, to show who they are at that point in the story, and more specifically, what they value most. So we're sort of setting up a baseline for your readers, and we're saying, this is the first big decision they've made. Now, who are they at this point in the story? And readers will measure their growth based on this scene for the rest of your novel. At this point, your protagonist is still going to be very firmly entrenched in what is called their harmful belief. Now, I don't expect you all to know necessarily what that means. We're going to go deep into the harmful belief in just a little bit. But to give you sort of the broad overview, because it's a term that's going to come up often, is the harmful belief is what is holding back your protagonist. It is something quite literally in the name. It is a belief they hold that is destructive or harmful to them, that is preventing them from moving forward and making the decisions that they need to make. And so at this first crossroad, the decision that they make is based in whatever that belief is that is going to be limiting them in the story, and that we're going to be trying to help them grow past over the course of your novel. Next up, we have the second crossroad, the next big decision of your story. And this is the decision to learn. Within your plot, your hero has been struggling up until now. Act two of most stories is when your hero is, they're in this new situation. They're sort of trying to get their feet under them. They're trying to learn, how do I handle these new people, these new relationships? What do I do about this conflict? They're going to be making a lot of mistakes. They're going to be falling flat on their face, probably quite often. But along the way, they've started to learn. They've started to make friends. They've started to gain skills or tools or abilities. And so the second crossroad within the realm of your plot is a chance for them to sort of show off a little bit. This is going to be the culmination of all of the tests and the obstacles that they've faced so far in your story. And this is a chance for them to use everything that they've learned to overcome that trial, to succeed at that point in the story. Meanwhile, in your character development, what allows them to succeed is the fact that they've started to learn a lesson. So we mentioned that harmful belief. They believe something. They have some wound or flaw or something going on inside of them that is preventing them from, moving forward, preventing them from making the decisions they need to make. And throughout your story, you started to put them in situations where they start to see another path. They start to learn, maybe it isn't this way. Maybe it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe there are other beliefs that I could hold that would serve me better. But it's not quite that easy. So at this point in the story, they still have that harmful belief, but they're starting to recognize this lesson that they need to learn. And so the second crossroad is kind of a hinge within your story where now they're holding both beliefs at once, but that's obviously very uncomfortable. And so they're going to be struggling to reconcile the two and kind of are stuck somewhere in the middle. And we're going to start moving them forward to try to get them past that stuck point throughout the rest of the story. From there, the third crossroad is the decision to regress. This is a dark moment for your protagonist. This is a difficult point in your story. Within your plot, this is where all of their past mistakes, their past failings, old enemies, betrayals, whatever it may be, this is where all of the things they didn't notice or the things they messed up on earlier in your novel come back to haunt them. And the rug is basically ripped out from under their feet. All of their plans kind of fall apart. This is often something of a false climax in your story where they think that they're about to solve the problem, they think they're about to solve your conflict, and then everything goes to hell in a handbasket. Everything falls apart, and they suffer a really crippling defeat. In terms of your character development, though, we're not doing this just to be mean to your character. Like, yes, difficult scenes, dramatic scenes can be fun to write, but we're really not doing it just to be like the mean author, making our character suffer. We're doing this because this is a chance to force them to face that harmful belief. So they're going to be sort of barreling towards this big challenge, this big, test that they're about to face. And when push comes to shove, when it comes down to it, they're going to make the wrong decision. They are going to make a decision that pulls them backwards, back into that harmful belief that they kind of started their story with, but they looked like they were growing past. But at this point, they're going to reject the lesson that they've been learning because it's difficult or scary or hard or whatever it may be. And in doing so, they make the wrong choice, and your story punishes them for it. They fail because of a decision they made. And that forces them to enter a period of deep reflection where now they have to step back and say, okay, I messed up. What happened? How did I get here? What has this journey been about so far? It's almost like a hibernation that they go into. And this is what starts to really force them to face that belief fully and start to recognize how it might be harming them and start to embrace their lesson by choice rather than just sort of by circumstance. And finally, the fourth crossroad, the big turning point, the big finale of your novel is ultimately the decision to change. So again, within your plot, this is your finale. This is where, after that big defeat, you're going to rally the troops, you're going to bring everyone together, and you're going to have one last face-off against your villain, your antagonist, the big bad, the conflict of your story, whatever it may be for your specific novel. And this is where your protagonist is going to call on everything they've gained throughout your story. Allies, lessons, skills, artifacts, eldritch beings, whatever it may be, to help them resolve the plot of your story. But again, what is allowing them to do so is not just your plot and all the things that have happened in your plot, but a decision they make. So again, at this finale, they're going to face another test where they are going to be forced to make a decision, this time a decision that proves they've learned their lesson, that has proved that they have changed as a person from the beginning of your story. And ultimately, they make the right choice here. They, sometimes will have to sacrifice something, but not necessarily. Sometimes this decision is just the act of making themselves uncomfortable or fighting for their new belief or fighting for people that maybe previously they wouldn't have, making some decision that they could not have made without the journey they just went on. And what I want you to really take away from this, even more so than necessarily the individual crossroads, although those are important, is that each of these is meant to represent one pivotal scene in your story. And again, I keep hammering this home because it is so important. They focus on an active decision that your protagonist is making. Your protagonist is not being pulled through this without any say in what happens. Even choosing to do nothing is still a choice. And so they're making choices actively in your story that is affecting the direction your novel goes in. Again, even if they feel forced into that decision, they have to own the consequences of whatever that decision was. To return to Mulan, I talked about those four decisions that she makes in her story, and those decisions were her crossroads. So if you think about, sort of zoom out and look at that whole story, her first crossroad is deciding to sneak into the army rather than let her father be killed. And that decision is what sort of drags her into the plot of the whole story. If she never made that decision, we wouldn't really have a story. Her second crossroad is the decision to pass the test that her commander has sort of given to everyone in boot camp. So far, she has been struggling in boot camp. Again, Act 2, the character is having a hard time usually. They are making mistakes, they are oftentimes overwhelmed or confused. No one really likes her in boot camp. She's having a really hard time. But by making this decision to not just walk away and give up, she earns the respect of all of her fellow soldiers. She earns the respect of her commander. She sort of finds her place in this community that allows us to swing over into Act 3, where now they're pursuing this conflict. They are, working to, okay, how can we stop this invasion that we've been called to defend against? And her third crossroad, that big defeat, is when it's revealed that she's in disguise. It's revealed that she's her father's daughter, not her father's son. That is a big no-no in her society, that, women don't have a lot of value in her society. And so rather though than embracing this lesson that she's learned of she's just as good as all these other soldiers, she can keep up, she can be a part of this crew, she apologizes. She retreats back into where she started, where she felt like she had to hide who she is. That triggers that period of deep reflection, and it leads us into the finale of her story and her fourth crossroad, where she stands up and fights as herself, rather than feeling like she has to hide who she is or hide behind other people. She uses what she's good at. She uses her cleverness. She uses her sort of wit to defeat the leader of the Huns, to sort of end this invasion and to ultimately save herself and her friends and her country. Basically, when you look at this, if you're familiar with this story, these are the biggest moments of the story. These are the set pieces, those big, impactful turning points that stick in our minds as sort of audience members of this movie. Now, I think it's important to say that while this method is a little bit different than a lot of story structures you might be familiar with, it does play nicely with the rest of your plot. You may recognize, if you're familiar with the 3-act structure or the 4-act structure, which you'll see is the one that I typically use when I'm teaching most of my students for a variety of reasons. But if you're familiar with any of those structures, you might recognize some of these crossroads by a variety of names. The midpoint, the dark night of the soul, crossing the threshold, the climax, the first plot point. The reason, though, that I like to refer to them as crossroads rather than as your midpoint is that crossroads, again, imply that decision. There are multiple paths. We have reached quite literally a crossroad in the story where your protagonist could make one decision and go in this direction, or make another decision and go in this direction. And so it gives them agency in the story. Again, those decisions were, the character does X rather than Y. Whereas the midpoint, I find a lot of writers think of, it's just a part of your plot. It's just things have to happen in the story at this point in the story. But the 4 crossroads come in to answer a little bit of why. Why does this have to happen at this point? Why is this so important? And the answer is the decisions your protagonist is making. Now, I have not been ignoring the Q&A box. I've seen you all drop some questions, so I know that was a lot of sort of big ideas and terms and things to think about. So I want to check for some big questions in the Q&A real quick. I apologize, I'm probably not going to be able to answer everyone's question just because we do have a limited amount of time and still a little bit that we're going to chat about in just a moment, but I'm going to try to tackle a couple big ones. Bria asks, how does this work when you have a multiple point of view story? That is an excellent question. So typically, if you have a multi-POV story, usually it's because you have multiple protagonists. So that's a bit of a generalization. There are certainly circumstances where that's not the case, but I would say most stories with 2-3 points of view is because each of those points of view are different protagonists within the story. And so they're all taking that central role. And so what you end up with is you basically end up with sort of like multiplying situation where each of those points of view, each of those protagonists is going to have their own four crossroads. They are all going to be making these four big decisions in the story, and that can start to get complicated. But the way I like to approach it is how can you put those characters in situations where their crossroads are happening pretty close together? So I like to use, I know it's not necessarily a fantasy example, but V for Vendetta, if anyone is familiar with that movie, is an excellent example of how to juggle multiple points of view. And if you look at that story with a slightly critical eye, you'll see that the three protagonists all face their crossroads usually in 1 to 2 scenes of each other. So I'm trying to pull out a specific crossroad if I can. So the first crossroad of that movie is V, sort of the terrorist character within the story, goes to blow up a telecom center that the other one of the other protagonists works at, while the third protagonist is a detective who is trying to catch V, and they all kind of converge in one spot. And what happens is uh, the sort of everyman character that kind of represents the sort of normal people in society basically mace a detective to save the life of the terrorist, which is a little bit complicated. Ultimately gets knocked out, but ends up saving the terrorist's life, prevents them from getting captured. She makes the decision to save someone that should be her enemy. V makes the decision to save her, and the detective makes the decision to let them go. And all three of those decisions rocket these characters into the plot of the story and tell us a lot about who they are as people. So obviously that's sort of a simplified version of it, but if you're juggling multiple points of view, finding ways to have those crossroads converge within 1 to 2 scenes of each other. It doesn't necessarily have to all be at the same time, but the closer you can get them, the more impact you have, and the more it feels like all of those points of view are part of the same story rather than separate stories. So, starting to look through a couple more questions. Jess says, how can we get sensitive to identifying these decisions as we read and watch other stories and movies? That is actually an excellent question. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the workshop because I have a kind of a brainstorming exercise for you to help you start to identify these and both identify these in your stories, but also more broadly, start to get a sense of where these are happening in other stories you might be reading or watching. So hang tight. Hopefully that will help you in a moment. Let's see. Mary asks, can you adapt this to a shorter work like a novella? Yes, absolutely. So in a full-length novel, you basically just have more time between these different crossroads. You have more space for additional scenes. The characters take a more like winding route to get to their next crossroad. Whereas in a shorter work where you have less space to work with, that winding route just sort of straightens out a little bit because you have less time to go sort of off on tangents and wander. You just end up being a little bit more focused. And then I think the last question I'm going to tackle for now before we keep going is Nancy asks, can these four crossroads be applied to a flat arc? And if so, how? So yes. So for just the sake of simplicity, I've been focused primarily on positive character arcs. So you'll notice the character starts with that harmful belief and sort of grows and ultimately overcomes that belief. For a negative arc, you basically invert that. They start with a harmful belief, and as they learn their lesson, they reject that lesson. So they're presented with, hey, maybe this is a better way, and they're like, nope, and they run backwards and they cling to their harmful belief even harder than they did at the beginning of the story. For a flat arc, the key to a flat arc is that the story is about the development of the people around the character rather than the character themselves. So a flat arc protagonist, their story is about they already know the lesson. So their first crossroad, they know that lesson, but the people around them do not. The people around them are rejecting it. And so if you think about these four crossroads for a flat arc, think about the decisions being made by your character's world rather than your character themselves. They still need to be making decisions, but they're usually making decisions in response to the choices of um, the people around them. And the choices of the people around them are sort of growing and changing as you go through each of these crossroads. Flat arcs are a little bit tricky, but I hope that starts to give you maybe a sense of how you could approach this. So I am going to continue on for the sake of time. We have a couple more things to chat about, and then I have a prompt for you all. The sort of next big idea of what I want to talk about before we wrap up is this idea that your crossroads show how your protagonist is changing as a person, but you need to start to get a sense of what belief are they changing from? What is their starting point? What is their ending point? And the better you have a sense of those two pieces, the easier it starts to be to map their journey, how they're actually going to move through this story. So we have mentioned a couple terms now, the harmful belief and the lesson. And I want to get into those a little bit more deeply. These are the two opposing beliefs that your protagonist is going to hold. And the reason I like to talk about them as beliefs is that we don't like to change our beliefs. Like, as human beings, changing what we fundamentally believe about ourselves and the world is uncomfortable. It feels weird. It feels threatening. And so changing your protagonist's belief is going to naturally be really difficult. But that also makes it really rewarding. And it also means that, again, what we believe about the world shapes all of our actions. It shapes how we interact with other people, the choices that we make, the way we respond to events. And so thinking about your protagonist's character arc, how they're going to develop throughout these crossroads in terms of what they believe, becomes really powerful because it gives you a really strong starting point to start to build out their journey. So we've already talked about these briefly, but just to sort of give a really clear definition, when we're talking about your character's harmful belief, this is the flawed belief that is preventing them from making the right decisions in your story. This basically creates a barrier between them and what they desire. So just to sort of pull an example out of my head, for a story like How to Train Your Dragon, speaking of fantasy, for anyone familiar with How to Train Your Dragon, that first movie, Hiccup's harmful belief is that it's wrong to be different, that being different is shameful. And that influences all of his choices and how he interacts with his world. He is constantly trying to be like all of the other people in his community, to earn their respect, to be loved by them, to feel worthwhile. And when he falls short of that and he doesn't manage to live up to those expectations, he feels deeply ashamed and he feels a lot of self-loathing about who he is as a person because he is different. On the flip side, your character's lesson is the truth or mental shift or new belief that they need to learn in order to succeed in your story, to find happiness, to heal as a person, whatever are the specifics of your story. And again, to pick on How to Train Your Dragon, Hiccup's lesson is that differences are what make us better people. The things that we can bring to the table that are unique and different is how we support each other and how we make the world a better place and how we, how we support the other people we care about. And that's a big change for him to go through. And the only way he goes through it is by experiencing these four crossroads where he is pushed into a corner and has to make a decision and slowly starts to change the decisions he's making. So to give another quick example, again, to pick on Mulan, we've talked about her four crossroads. We have a sense of how her story unfolds. But the beliefs that are kind of underneath the surface are that at the beginning of the story, she believes that a daughter will always be less valuable than a son. She disguises herself as her father's son because she doesn't feel like she can do anything or have any value as his daughter. She has a lot of her own sort of self-loathing and shame around who she is and how she feels she's failing her family because she deeply believes that she is less valuable because she is a woman. Now, that belief is put on her by her society. She didn't come up with it out of nowhere, but that doesn't make it any less real, and it influences all of her choices at the beginning of the story. But that starts to change as her story unfolds, and she starts to realize that she is no different and no less worthy than anyone else, that she deserves to be respected, that she deserves to be seen for what she's good at. She doesn't have to be a man to be loved and respected. She can be clever. She can be, kind of a smartass. Like she doesn't have to be this one rigid ideal to be valuable as a person. And again, the value of those crossroads are that they show how her beliefs are changing slowly over time. We don't jump from just one to the other. We have multiple points in the story where she has this major experience, this major test that she has to face, and she makes slightly different decisions at each one, allowing that journey, that growth for her as a character, to feel really believable and organic and natural. For those of you who are asking about other types of character arcs, this exact process applies for a negative arc, except for they start out with their harmful belief and they end with an even worse, more destructive belief by the end because they reject their lesson. They're shown this lesson and they, dig their heels in and they put their shields up and they refuse to listen. And for a flat arc character, their world starts out with this destructive, harmful belief, and their world ends the story having started to learn this lesson. Ultimately, good stories are about change. Change creates stakes, it creates risk and consequences, but it also gives, again, a reason for your readers to care about your plot, a reason for readers to care about all the things happening in your story beyond it's interesting, because they want to see your hero succeed. And if change is required for that, if your hero has to learn difficult lessons and change as a person, how they show up in the world, all the better. That means the stakes are higher and the consequences are bigger, and the journey is going to be difficult. And so by the end of it, it will feel so rewarding for having made it there. So we have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to try to get through this quickly. How can you do this for your own protagonist? In all likelihood, you might know a couple of these crossroads by instinct. You might have gone through this and said, oh, I already have a sense of these, because these are typically going to be the biggest set pieces of your story. So someone asked in the Q&A, well, how do we start to get a sense of these in other stories or in our own stories? And oftentimes, I usually recommend starting by looking to those big moments. Looking to the moment Mulan runs away from home and joins the army, because man, like, talk about a point of no return. It's made very clear that she'll probably be killed if she tries to come home because she's broken this really big law. Like, they can't reveal what she's done and go and find her. She has crossed a threshold in the story. I also find it helpful, if you've already started to try to apply story structure to your plot and you have a sense of, oh, well, this is my midpoint or this is my climax, look for the decision that your protagonist is making in those scenes. Do they make a key decision? And if they don't, how could you start to put a little bit more agency into their hands? What is the crossroad that they're facing where they could do X or they could do Y? And how does the decision they make move the story forward? But if you're struggling with that still, if you're still not quite sure how to move forward, I like to ask, what decisions does your protagonist believe they could never make, or so they think, at the start of the story? And that is pretty much your homework for this workshop, the I could never prompt. Once you have started to get a sense of your protagonist's harmful belief and lesson, I recommend you start there. Set a timer for 30 minutes, for an hour, for 15 minutes, if that's all you have, and really focus your mind and brainstorm everything you could think of where your protagonist believes they could never do X at the start of the story. Most of those may not make it into your novel, and that's okay. But this will start to get your brain thinking about oh, my protagonist could never, defeat a foreign invasion. My protagonist could never survive army boot camp. My protagonist could never ride on the back of a dragon, whatever it is. And then you can use these as jumping off points to start to build out their four crossroads. How can you then force them into situations where they have to do those things? They have to make the decision that actually, yes, I can do this. And what are they learning along the way that's going to help them get there? So, right on time. That was our workshop for today. I so appreciate you all being here. I so appreciate you all hanging out with me. Real quick, if you have any desire to stay in touch, I know I shared this with the Pro Writing Aid team, so I'm sure there's going to be links in various places. But I have a free character interview workbook called 50 Questions to Ask Your Protagonist. For any of you who are sitting here thinking like, I'm having a really hard time figuring out this harmful belief in this lesson, like what decisions could they make? That guide will help you think about your character in a lot of really fresh and sort of new ways to hopefully help you get a sense of that. You can get it at thenovelSmithy.com/50-questions if you're interested. And Joe, just to check on time, do we need to wrap up since we're at the top of the hour, or do you think I have time to answer a couple more questions?
I think, can you hear me okay, Lewis?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I think we could probably go for another few minutes, but we do only have a few minutes left, I would say.
Okay.
Probably go till about 5 minutes past the hour.
Okay. Well, I'll try to speed round. I'll try to get at least like two questions real fast.
Okay, no worries.
I am going to just scroll through real quick. Ben asks, do you recommend doing something like this for your antagonist as well? Yes and no. I don't think you need to build in these crossroads with quite the same amount of focus for your antagonist because they're not quite the same level of like focal point in your story. And they also aren't necessarily changing in the same way your protagonist is. You're not necessarily taking them on this full character arc. However, it can be helpful to think about the decisions they're making at different points in your story because you can think of it as how are their decisions at odds with the decisions your protagonist is making? How are the decisions that your antagonist is making pushing your protagonist into uncomfortable situations and into these situations where they experience these crossroads? That can be really helpful, but you don't necessarily need to sit down and like plot this whole thing out for your protagonist as well as your hero unless you really find that that's helping you think through how your protagonist is showing up in the story or how your antagonist is showing up in the story. Deborah asks, can they have multiple beliefs or should there just be one central one? I would really encourage you to drill down and find one central harmful belief. They can certainly believe many things that influence their story, but in terms of shaping their crossroads really need to be anchored around one clear harmful belief because that not only helps you simplify things, why make things more complicated than we need to, but it also helps readers follow along with their journey a little bit more easily because the journey that they're going on is a lot clearer when you're focused on one main thing, even if smaller beliefs might be shaping their actions at different points in the story. And let's see, one last quick one. Andrea, do you have a book on this? Yes, I actually do. I actually wrote two books, Write Your Hero and Mastering Character Arcs. You can find links to them on my website, thenovelSmithy.com. You can find them on Amazon. They go through this concept in tremendous depth. And for those of you who were saying like, well, I'm writing a flat arc, or I'm writing a negative arc, or any other arc, those books go into a lot more detail on the nuances of how that works for every different sort of primary character arc. So if you do want to dig deeper into that, I would highly recommend those. I think they're a pretty good starting place to really get deeper into this topic. And I think I'm gonna hold it there so we have time to wrap up. Thank you for letting me run a little bit long. As you can tell, I am a chatty person.
That's okay. I think I don't know if you guys can see me, but I think my camera has decided to stop working, but I hope you can still hear me. I just wanted to say that was such a brilliant session. I got so much out of that personally, and I'm sure everyone attending did. So a big thank you to Lewis for generously spending your time with us. Really do appreciate it. And having seen all the kind of Mulan chat in the chat going on, for my money, Reflection and Make a Man Out of You are two of the best Disney songs ever made, I think. So
I'm
thanks,
so
yeah.
glad. I feel so validated.
But yeah, thanks again so much. It's been fantastic. As always, guys, you can find the replay to this session and all the other sessions in the Fantasy Writers Week Hub. The links are in the chat. And thank you again, Lewis. We hope all of the chat and all of you guys who attended can join us for our next session. And yeah, thanks again.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. See you later.